Hello everyone, and welcome back to Cravon Studios ShopTalk. So happy to be talking to you today. Sorry this one's a bit late. It's end of financial year. The day job kind of took up a lot of time recently, but that's all right. So today I wanted to do something a little different. Than instead of talking about a particular game mechanic, I wanted to talk about a game style. And in this case, it's role-playing games. And it's come up recently. One of the sister podcasts we have for the Boomer Radio Network is the Obligatory RPG podcast, and there's a myriad of them out there. I enjoy listening to Dungeon Masters Ludus from those guys. They're actually kind of a staple in the gaming industry from tabletop and on. I mean, there's different categories of them, but they're a very interesting study. And board games themselves can take on aspects of role-playing games or have role-playing aspects in them. So it's one of those things that you may be deciding to make an entire role-playing game from scratch. You may want to use something like the Open Gaming License, the OGL from Wizards / Hasbro, to be able to create content for other role-playing games, or to create a scene and setting in kind of your own game based on another system. So role-playing games kind of had their genesis back in 1971-ish. Like when Chainmail came out and they created that, it was more of a role-playing system for miniatures, fantasy-based miniatures. Not necessarily the whole game, not necessarily the character progression and stuff, but it was about controlling miniatures. But that gave rise to Dungeons and Dragons. Obviously, you can't talk about role-playing games without mentioning the grandfather of them all. And when Arneson and Gygax came up with that, it set a whole new mark for role-playing games, or for games in general. And it allowed people to express themselves in kind of in a game construct or in a way that really gave them some freedom. Yes, it was considered a nerdy hobby, but I always pictured it, or I always thought of it as a hobby for intellectuals. A lot of mind work and exercising your mind in there with stats and dice and rolling and how you wanted your character progression to go. Hey, at least it was good enough where they played it in E.T., right? They're playing D&D in E.T. So the history of them, there's been a lot of role-playing games. And I think in the 70s they were starting to find their feet, of course. Dungeons and Dragons was there, and I played D&D, I played Traveler, Gamma World, a few others back in the 70s, but things really started to pick up in the 80s. The publishing scene got a little easier. People started realizing this was a thing. It became something people wanted to do, and in the 80s we had Dragon Quest and Rollmaster and Top Secret and Call of Cthulhu and Champions and Marvel superheroes, DC superheroes, Boot Hill. I played Paranoia and Twilight 2000 and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. That was a lot of fun. Even things like the Harnmaster system and GURPS, games based on GURPS and Mech Warrior and Robotech. It was just incredible. We got into the cyberpunk world with Shadowrun, and it was an amazing explosion of role-playing games and explosions of creativity. Now that wasn't without friction. I remember my dad, he sat me down and made me watch Pastor Gary on TV tell me about the evils of role-playing games and how people were being consumed by them, and how one mother threw her son's miniature figures away in the garbage can, and she could hear them screaming from the garbage can, and I think that probably had a little more to do with her than it did with her son. But anyway, no good things don't have a little controversy with them, like rock and roll. So 80s were kind of the explosion in time. Dungeons and Dragons was still the king of that era. There were different genres, different aspects. Star Frontiers and Star Trek and Star Wars. Back then, games came out for sci-fi, Boot Hill for westerns, Top Secret for espionage, Champions DC and Marvel superheroes for the superhero aspect, Call of Cthulhu if you're a horror fan. And then a bit later, we had things like Paranoia, We had Killer, which was Killer, the assassination game, was more of like one of the first kind of live action role playing games, because you played that in real life. Not you went out and killed people, but you would be given assignments, and you'd have like this gangster mafia aspect, and you would have to go and find who your assignment was, and like take a picture of them or stick a sticker on them or somehow indicate you had killed them, report that back as them being eliminated. It was kind of fun and great to play at conventions. Although I do remember some conventions saying, "Thou shalt not play Killer." But yeah. So that kind of got us into the 90s. And the 90s was another big explosion of role-playing games. However, the 90s were largely dominated by the World of Darkness. Now, the World of Darkness started with Vampire the Masquerade. And that gave rise to Vampire, and you had Werewolf, Mage, Wraith, Changeling. And there was a whole raft of those games. And this really brought other characters, other people into the fold. One of the things that the World of Darkness and the kind of the live action aspect of it, it gave rise to like the Camarilla Club, which is a global organization of live action role players that would dress up as their characters and get together and role play, live action role play for a night or two. Despite the legal issues that White Wolf had with the Camarilla Club and the Friends, and how they had issues when they got bought and stuff. But it showed that there was a whole new realm of people that would be getting into these games. In fact, World of Darkness was touted for raising the women in gaming. The World of Darkness games actually had close to a 50-50 ratio of men to women playing them, which is one of the highest in the gaming industry. I find that very fascinating. But anyway, I kind of digress. But those games went from tabletop, and like Vampire the Masquerade, up through live action role playing. And the different aspects of role playing games, you've got that. You have tabletop, where you're mostly playing from your character sheet with your dice, with your game master, and playing through a scenario or an adventure. Either the game master might have purchased a module or a campaign. They might be playing out of Greyhawk or Forgotten Realms, or different ones. Or they may be making it up on the fly. They may have generated their own adventures. This is kind of what got me into designing games. When I was playing Dungeons & Dragons, I would create adventures. I would create campaigns. I probably created more than I should, because we never got very far before something happened in my life and we changed. But that creativity sparked a lot of that game design, for me anyway. And it might for you as well. It even gave rise to me developing my first kind of character progression game, but skirmish based. Now, back then, there was a game called Blood of Heroes that was a role-playing game called Blood of Heroes. It was actually superhero based. So Blood of Heroes is very superhero based. And I designed a game, Blood of Heroes, based on the movie with Rutger Hauer in it, where you would play the kind of skirmish game they played. We get the dog skull and try to get it on the spike at the end. And you had your chainers and your blockers. And I designed that, but I added character progression to it, straight out of a role-playing game like Dungeons & Dragons. And each match you played would affect the future matches and stuff. Maybe I invented the first Legacy game back in the 80s. So that whole role-playing aspect and that creativity really kind of spurred me on as far as game development goes, game design. The systems that went through, you had the different genres, and Dungeons & Dragons owned the fantasy space. It was very interesting to watch, though, because in 2009, Pathfinder came out. And it happened to come out at a time when people were disillusioned with Dungeons & Dragons 3.5, and how things had kind of gotten weird, and the D20 system was a bit weird, and GURPS was kind of going all different directions. And Pathfinder took advantage of that. And Pathfinder became just as popular as D&D, but much faster, because now people knew what to expect. If you go to major conventions like Gen Con or something, you can go into the role-playing halls. There is a ginormous conference room for Dungeons & Dragons. And there's an equally ginormous conference room just for Pathfinder. So it's interesting to see how that worked. So the king can be toppled. And I just, have done some interviews on my Games on Tables podcast, and I was talking to Keith Dillon Franks, and he's working on a game where he wants to create something that's going to be a competitive one-on-one card game similar to Magic. And he thinks he's going to take on Magic. That's a big thing to try to take on. So if you're going to create a role-playing game, you're going to create a game that's going to play with the big boys like that, be realistic. There's nothing saying you can't do it, but consider the marketing you'd have to do, and consider the money that's going to have to go into it to actually get that in the front of mind for enough people to make your game endeavor a success. So by all means, create role-playing games, create one-on-one tournament-based card games, create competitive board games, but go at it realistically. Anyway, so after Pathfinder, things kind of changed a bit, and we're kind of here in modern day. But role-playing games, there's as many systems for role-playing games almost as there were role-playing games for a while. You've got like the D&D system, which went through the D20 system, kind of spun off, and there's the open gaming license. So if you want to create content that works the same way Dungeons & Dragons works, which uses attribute-based mechanics, 3d6 or 4d6 attributes, d20 combat, that style of combat mechanism, that style of structure, you can actually use the open gaming license and use that stuff in your game. You can use it to create content and modules for Dungeons & Dragons, or you can use it to create your own games. So we'll include this link to that system, as well as links in the show notes on where you can find more information about that. But there are other systems you might want to consider. You have things like the Fate system. Now, the Fate system is actually a narrative game system. It's more about the story and less about the system. I think that the tagline is the Fate system, where the system gets out of the way of the game. It's more about player decision and actions and acting and deciding what your character has and how it works. The dice rolls are really just, you start with a base like fighting attribute, and you roll pluses and minuses on the dice. You either do a +4, +5 and do legendary success, or -1, -2 and really fail the attempt. But then that's really it, succeed or failure. And then the narrative story comes out and you decide what that looks like and how it looks like. There are no critical hit tables. There are no critical fumble tables. It's all based on the narrative, which is pretty good, and it's very flexible. It's more like character-guided improv. You have things like the FASERIP system. Sorry, FASERIP is FASERIP. Now, the FASERIP system was famous in Marvel and DC superheroes. So you've got the character classes, D10-based system. That was very popular and still is very popular for superhero-based games. You've got action point allocation systems like White Wolf, all those games, games in the World of Darkness, where you would have a point-based number. So I'm going to have an X number of points for this character, and you allocate those points to get skills or attributes or different aspects of your character. Champions uses a system where you have points allocated to it, and then you take penalties or you take negatives. Like if you have a dependent, let's say you're a superhero, but you have a secret identity, well, that's going to be a -2 points, which means you can spend 2 points to get a superpower or flight or something like that. Kind of this point balance system. Iron Crown Enterprises came out with their HARP system, and the HARP system was the high adventure role-playing system that is pretty good. It's very much like D&D. It's kind of like that. But you can do dice-based systems, non-dice-based systems, totally narrative, and somewhere in between. You can go completely table-based, where everything you do is based on lookup. Here is your stat number. Here's the attempt you need to make, and that results in X, Y, or Z. But it depends on how much you want to create, how much you want to print, versus how much you want to let people just carry on with the story. I would say that from a purely publishing standpoint, from a purely cost of production standpoint, the more tables, charts, dice, sheets, instructions, lists you create, the more expensive your book is going to be, the more expensive your system is going to be to produce and to purchase. If you can just give somebody some guideline rules and maybe one or two tables, and just say, look, flip a coin, use a standard poker deck, draw from it, and allocate different suits to different things. There's some game systems that use tarot cards for exactly that. A friend of mine, Steve D, is working on his game Relics, which is a game about angels that are stuck on Earth, and he uses a tarot deck system to determine table lookups or determine success or failure. So try these different things. Try these different things out. From systems, you can get into the mechanics, and different systems will include different mechanics. And some of these, like we mentioned, are point-based or dice-based. That would be a mechanic. Some games are class-based, where you choose a class, and that kind of defines the set of skills you have to choose from, or the set of other things you can do. Other ones will be pretty much free-form. Here's a list of skills and attributes and things you can use, and you pick the ones you want. And as you pick those, your character kind of evolves and kind of emerges into whatever it's going to be based on the types of skills you've chosen. You can specialize in certain categories of skills, like espionage. You might want to take computer cracking and lock picking and spycraft and things. Or you might want to take very martial skills or very intellectual skills, research, development, or a little bit of each. But that gives you a lot of control. It gives the player a lot of control over how their characters evolve. Now you can have aspects of this in a board game, in a tabletop board game. Gloomhaven's a good example of that. The characters you have in Gloomhaven do evolve. They do get levels. You do get to choose different skills, and you do get to choose different cards that you're going to be putting in their decks that they'll be able to draw their actions from. So there is an evolution. You do get to determine how your characters move and react in combat. Your individual scenario goals will determine kind of what they're after, what they're looking for in that combat. I suppose if you wanted to make that a little more role-playing, instead of randomly drawing a scenario goal, each class or each character class could have a list of them that they would typically go for. So, that would be a little more in character, I would think. But you could include some of this in there. Attributes and stats, we've learned from theirs. There's action table-based role-playing games, like I said, where you're just looking things up. A lot of war games, tabletop war games, use table after table after table for determining results and kind of rock, paper, scissors combat things. But if you start combining your board game with aspects of a role-playing game and giving players that agency, you might find it very interesting, very engaging. Because there's some players who are okay with roll and move. I roll my dice, I move my pawn, I do what it says on the square, and then I do it again. Other people, they want to have control. And one of the things that I think almost all game designers say is players want agency, which means they want to control their own fate. They want to feel that they're in control of where they're going and what they're doing. Players want interesting decisions that are impactful. And players want to engage and have a sense of accomplishment or victory. You can certainly do those in a board game without role-playing game aspects, but I think putting in some role-playing game sauce on a board game will really heighten that. Character progression is a really good way to do that, and character progression based on skill choices or based on equipment choices, even that is enough of a role-playing aspect to get someone to bond with that character and be more engaged in the game. So let me know what you think of role-playing games and their activities and how the two might blend with, tabletop and role-playing or board-based and role-playing. As always, if there is something you want me to cover, leave a comment or drop me a line on Twitter or something. It's at Cravon Studios, and I'll try to cover it. So until next time, I'm Rocky, and thanks for watching Cravon Studios Shop Talk.